It was September 4th, 2012. We were listening to Taylor Swift as the #1 song, and a brand new operating system was released, Windows Server 2012, which offered a huge number of new features and updates. And so we got the few hundred floppy disks and we upgraded with glee. We wanted to embrace this new operating system. Well, now it's today. And Windows Server 2012 is reaching the end of life October 10th, 2023. We can see the end of life statement, and very clearly it's telling us, hey, we'll end on October 10th, 2023 for both Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. And so we need to get off of Windows Server 2012. What can we do? So if we think about where we are with having Windows Server 2012, we have our instance. Now again, this could be 2012 or it could be the 2012 R2. And if I think about, well, what is that operating system? The operating system itself has a number of roles and features. So I can think about, well, there might be particular roles, could be a domain controller, a certificate server, DNS server, IIS. There are things that are built into the OS. Maybe that's the primary function of this particular instance. Then obviously on top of that, often we install various applications. A big one, especially if I'm thinking about 2012, I might have SQL Server 2012 running on that as well. So I'm in this state where I have a number of 2012 instances in my environment. Now, as Mr. Miyagi would always say, the best defense is to not be there. So if we can, let's just get off of Windows 2012. Now, we have a number of options for how I can think about getting off 2012. A very obvious one would be, well, hey, I will just go ahead and just create a newer, this could be 2016, maybe 2019, 2022, a newer version of the operating system. And it is just a fresh installation. Now, when I have this fresh installation, how do I get what's running on here over to there? And that's going to vary. It could be as simple as, well, hey, I can just reinstall the application. I don't have to do any even maybe migration. For example, many Windows roles, I could just re-enable it on the new box. If I was to think about domain controller, typically I'll DC promo up to a new controller and demote the old one. I don't really have to bother migrating many things. Or maybe I do actually have to perform a migration. I have to take certain state that is on this box, and I need to get that state moved. Now, the exact function of doing that migration is going to vary. If I'm thinking about various Windows roles and features, and I've got the links to all these documents below, it goes through, hey, look, we have the Windows Server migration tools. There are other speciality tools, for example, things around storage, but there are migration guides to walk me through, hey, how can I move each of these particular features? And then there's a summary matrix at the end to give you guidance on, look, what is the best approach to achieve getting off of my roles on this Windows 2012 and getting to a fresh operating system. Now, the other thing I do obviously have to consider is the compatibility of these. So whatever checks I'm doing as part of this, I have to check what is the compatibility of my application. Now, for Microsoft, they publish that. I can go and look at all of the different Microsoft apps, and it talks about its compatibility with, for example, here, Windows Server 2016. but this is only for the Microsoft applications. You're going to be responsible for, if it's a third-party app, checking, hey, what is their support statement for newer versions of the operating system? And you may find this is where you hit a roadblock, and we're going to come back to that if I can't get off of Windows 2012. So we've checked the compatibility, but maybe the migration is just too difficult. Maybe I can't do a fresh installation. Maybe I've lost the installation media. Whatever it may be, our other option here is, instead of doing this fresh installation, well, what I could also do is an in-place upgrade. And this used to be hugely frowned on for server operating systems. We didn't like to do an in-place upgrade. But if we look at what they've done with Windows Server and Windows Client, you don't really upgrade the operating system anyway. What happens now is, when I do an in-place upgrade of Windows Client or Windows Server, it looks at the instance. It says, well, what's the OS? What's not the OS? It takes the what's not the OS and tucks it away safely. And then it basically wipes away the disk. It lays down a fresh image from your installation media, not floppy disk, and then brings back the other stuff and layers it on top of it. So you're always really getting a fresh install anyway. It's taking care of taking the state that isn't the OS and putting it back there for you. Now, if I think about this in-place upgrade approach, what's supported for doing this is my newer operating system, when I'm coming from, can be N-2. So what that would mean is, if I was running Windows 2012, well, I could go to 2016 because there's an R2 in the middle. If I was running Windows 2012 R2, I could go to 2016 or 2019. So I can do that in-place upgrade. Again, even if I'm doing in-place upgrade, you still need to check to see, hey, what is the compatibility? Does the software allow you to do an in-place upgrade of the operating system? They may say, we don't support an in-place upgrade. There's something about that capturing of the other state and bringing it back they don't like. So you want to validate that. Now, really what I've been talking about here, for the most part, applies anywhere, but this could be on premises. It could be if it's up in the cloud or another cloud. I have these same options available to me, whatever. So this could be or other. This really just applies everywhere. But now let's make it a little bit more interesting. What if now our destination becomes Azure? And we'll see there are some special considerations when I start thinking about, well, I want to go to Azure. Here we're going to migrate, and a lot of companies will take the opportunity of, hey, I've got this Windows 2012 legacy estate. I really want to either get off of 2012 or I need to somehow keep it supported. Is this an opportunity to get to the cloud? Maybe it's an opportunity to migrate. Maybe it's an opportunity to modernize. So I want to look at what I could actually do around there. Now, if I think about Azure, Azure has a whole set of different services. An obvious thing I have is IaaS. I have infrastructure as a service, which is fundamentally a VM in the cloud. So obviously I could just stay as is. I could just take my Windows 2012 and run it up here. Now you may wonder, well, what's the benefit of that? I'm going to get to that, but there is actually a benefit of moving it to an Azure or an Azure platform. This could be Azure VMware solution. It could be the Nutanix cloud that runs on the Azure Bare Metal. It could even be Azure Stack solutions. It's Azure. If I run 2012 on there, I get some extended security updates benefits. Or obviously, I can take this opportunity to do the N+2. So this again is where the idea of, well, if it was 2012, I could go to 2016. If it was R2, well, I could go to 2019. Or if there was some limited compatibility, I can't get to 2019, but I go 2016, I could do that as well. And so when I think about this moving to the cloud, there's a set of compatibility, readiness checks I would want to do. So what can help when I think about those readiness checks? Well, we have this solution of Azure Migrate. So we can leverage Azure Migrate, and there's a whole set of different components to this. Now, the first part is there's an appliance. So we run this appliance, and this appliance will basically go and do a discovery. And once it's discovered things, it can then go and do an assessment. And it can run that against a whole set of different environments. This could be running Hyper-V. This could be running ESX. This could be running bare metal. It doesn't matter. It can go and discover all of these various things. And it can do Windows and Linux, but we're focused on Windows right now. And it's free. It's free for the discovery. It's free for the assessment. It's free for the migration if we want to use it for that. Now, one thing it doesn't do, it will not migrate roles to a fresh installation. That is not a part of its functionality today. But one of the great things, I could use it even if I just wanted to do the discovery and it could help me on the assessment part. I literally wouldn't have to use it for anything more than that if I didn't want to. But I can use this to maybe go and find out what I actually have. So if we go and take a look, see here I've got my Azure Migrate environment. And it's already been onboarded with the appliances. It's done the discovery. And we can see, for example, there's been a number of assessments already run. You could go and run a new one. You can select what I want to go and run it against. But if I just go and look at my VM assessments, for example, something super, super simple, one of the really basic things it's going to show me straight away is, well, are they ready to run for Azure? It's going to give me an idea of costs based on, hey, the compute requirements for the VM and then storage costs. But it's also going to show me something interesting here is what is the OS support status? And it's telling me, well, all four of them would be in extended. And it's doing that because all four of them are Windows 2012 based. So I could point this at my whole environment and say, look, give me some information. So it's going to go and find out what exactly can do. Once we've got that assessment, well, now let's consider we do actually want to think about, well, okay, great. I now know what I have. What I would actually want to do as part of this is let's migrate it. Let's take this opportunity and get it running in Azure. And it can do this in a number of different ways, because what I can do is, as part of the migration, so we're going to migrate it to Azure, it can optionally, so this is optional, do an in-place upgrade. Now, the really important part of this is when it does the in-place upgrade, the original on-prem is not changed at all. So what this allows me to do is, let's take the existing 2012 R2 OS as is, create a disk in Azure, and then if I want to try the OS in-place upgrade, it'll take a copy of that disk, upgrade it, I can do my checks. If it doesn't work, scrap it and just use the 2012 or 2012 R2 as is, but it's not messing with this on-prem at all. So it gives me a lot of flexibility in exactly, hey, what is my confidence here? So if I go back and we can see this, if I come out of the assessment, and now let's just go and look, if we scroll down, then we see the migration tools. Well, I can see all my Azure VMs. And a part of my Azure VMs, I can see all the ones that are replicated. So it has to have the replication happen. That's the first thing that it does. It replicates the disk to Azure every couple of minutes. It's still running on-prem. There's no VM in Azure yet. So I'm not paying for any Azure compute charges. It's just created those. But now, once it's replicating, let's go and look at one of these. If I click the context menu on the side, we can see I've got these choices, test migration and migration. Now, the only difference really here is a test migration, it won't modify the on-prem VM at all. It creates the VM in a test virtual network. It adds test to the VM name, and then I can test the things out. If I just do migration, it will shut down the on-prem VM because it's assuming, hey, I want to move this actually to Azure. The recommendation would always be to do a test migration first, and then assuming it comes up, it's happy, hey, I can then go ahead and delete the test and do the proper migration. But here's the interesting thing. It can absolutely move it, and this is actually an R2, but it can move it as is, but I also have this upgrade available. And if I select that, I can now pick, again, it's the N plus 2, so it's on 2012 R2, which means I can go to 2016 or 2019. Again, if it was just regular 2012, I'd only be able to go to 2016. But it's going to give me this option to say, look, what we can do for you is we'll actually try and upgrade it as well. So I get a lot of nice options here to get some validation. Hey, I think it should work, but with zero risk. I'm not messing with anything on premises. And actually, I guess while I'm here, I probably should have shown you anyway, there's also a more in-depth ability because once it goes and does that assessment, the other nice thing I can actually do in here, let's go back over to the assessment, it does have this concept of business cases. Now the business case is a lot more in depth. I have to have run the discovery first, but then once I've run that discovery, it can now go and do things like a return on investments. Your CXOs can, well, is Azure beneficial? I can see 1 and 3 and 5 year return on investments and savings. So here, for example, I ran it and it shows me the current costs and how it would change if I actually moved it to Azure. It's also going to show me interesting things about savings, like Azure Hybrid Benefit, but there's also this concept of, well, that's interesting. I might save $237,000 because of extended security updates. Interesting. Don't know what that's all about, but we're obviously going to come back to that. But it's given me these great sets of information to help me with what I'm trying to achieve. Now, remember, there are other options we have in Azure. That was certainly one of them. But if I think about Azure, the other big option we have, and generally is preferred if we can, is PaaS, Platform as a Service. Now I'm modernizing my application. Now for the PaaS option, if the application today is, let's say my target is Azure App Service, if it is an IIS ASP.NET app running on VMware, there's built-in functionality to actually migrate it to App Service. So one of the things I can do is I could go to App Service. What about if I'm running SQL Server? Well, there's a whole set of SQL services. So here I can think about, well, obviously there's Azure SQL DB, there's Azure SQL Managed Instance. There's even, hey, I can have IaaS SQL Server. And there's extensions that builds on that. And what I can get as part of these migration services is readiness for which of these is the right option. And then it can actually give me a recommendation and right sizing. So I can take that database that's running somewhere. And when I talk about somewhere, again, this can be in many different places. Hey, this would be the right target for getting into an Azure database service. So this is all fantastic. Let's get off of 2012. What if I can't get out the way in the Mr. Miyagi style? What if I have to stay on 2012? The application isn't supported for anything beyond 2012. What if, again, I don't have the installation media, I don't have any support, or I've tested it and it doesn't work on a newer version of the operating system? Now, I have to support it somehow. Because if it's running a production workload, what I can't do is not continue to get support and important updates, critical updates, security updates for the operating system. So this is where we start talking about, well, I need extended security updates. And this is really the key part of all of these things we're talking about. I need to be able to have extended security updates. And how do I get that? And what is the associated cost with getting that additional 3 years of extended updates? And we can see this if we go and look at documentation. And notice it is saying Windows Server and SQL. And it talks about, well, look, SQL 2012 end of support was July 12, 2022. Windows 2012 and 2012 R2, October 10th. And it then gives me the option of, well, yeah, I need these extended security updates. And it's talking a lot about only on Azure. But when it talks about only on Azure, it includes, hey, look, Azure Dedicated Host, Azure VMware, the Azure Nutanix solution, and Azure Stack. So anything where that Azure Fabric is what is running that workload. So when we talked about moving it to Azure, well, if I'm running it on Azure in this IaaS and I'm sitting here, that ESU is free. That additional 3 years, I'm getting it for free because it's just running in Azure. And when I say the word Azure, it's not just an Azure VM. Again, this also applies to the Azure VMware solution, the Nutanix solution, and Stack, and the dedicated host as well. So all of these, and that's Hub, that's Edge, that's HCI, I get ESU free. So now my Windows 2012, hey, I can get that additional 3 years of extended security updates, and I'm not paying anything. Great. I can't get to Azure. I've got some anchor, some mainframe it talks to, there's some element to it, and I cannot move it to Azure to get the free ESU. I cannot get it on an Azure plane where Azure Stack HCI on-prem, for example, where I would get it free, or Edge or Stack. Well, so then we're paying for it. So if I'm staying on-prem, now it's costing us dollars. And we've been able to do this in the past for example, Windows 2008. And the way it works is we have this traditional. So I have a traditional annual. So I purchase it and it's for the year, and then I pay another year at the end of that year. It's an annual purchase for this ESU. And to do this, and this is going to apply to all of it, I do need software assurance. But now there's a new option. So I can do this traditional annual, or there's now an Arc enabled option. So this is ESU enabled by Azure Arc. And as the name suggests, well, firstly, there's a requirement here. To be able to use this, the operating systems have to be Arc enabled. And that is the 2012 OS. If these were VMs running on a host, I can't just onboard the host. Every operating system that I want to use the Arc enabled ESU has to be Arc enabled. They have to be onboarded to Arc. Now, I did a full detailed video on Azure Arc, but the Arc enablement is free. It does bring other features for free around policy of the control plane and tagging, basic inventory capabilities, and there's other services you can add on top of that. But this I could use anywhere. It could be running in AWS or GCP or on-prem, Oracle, Alibaba. It doesn't matter. It works on multi-cloud. The Azure Arc footprint is tiny. It's tens of megabytes of memory. It's, I think, maybe 150 megabytes of storage. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of a bit of a CPU. It does require connectivity. So when I'm thinking about these options, one thing Arc does need is to be able to go and talk to Azure. It can support a small duration of disconnection. Actually, I think the smallest days it can be disconnected for, but it requires that connectivity to Arc. So in an complete air gap solution, you'd have to go the traditional approach. But if it can get connectivity, now this connectivity could just be regular, hey, it's got an internet connection. It could be via a proxy. It could be either private endpoint, and then it's using maybe an express route, private peering, or site-to-site VPN. That's all fine. It just needs an ability to go and talk to this Azure control plane for the Arc services. It's the 1.34 or above agent for this to work. And again, I did a whole video going through this and showing it. There's going to be some work to get onboarded to the Arc, but realize it brings you a huge set of additional features. But now one of those features is, hey, I can now do this monthly. And that's the key thing. I get a huge amount of flexibility now for this Arc enablement. It's not this huge CapEx upfront annual purchase. Now it's just this monthly charge. It goes against my Azure consumption, so it decrements any commitments you may have there. Again, I still need software assurance. But if I upgrade, for example, to 2016, then I stop paying at the end of that month. It's not that it's huge, now I'm stuck there for a full year. Now, if you did the traditional, where you purchased a whole year, at the end of the year, I could then switch to the Arc. So if maybe, hey, I didn't get this organized, maybe I didn't get the Arc infrastructure rolled out in time to leverage this, you could always do the traditional for the first year, and at the end of the year, you can't convert it. This is an upfront, I'm purchasing the year, but at the end of the year, sure, you could then come back and you could change it and switch over to the Arc-enabled option. So you do have that flexibility. Now, the way this Arc-enabled ESU is working is it's a license. So what I'm purchasing here are ESU licenses. And I'm purchasing a license based on, well, what is that target? And it supports both physical core and virtual core. And there are some minimums that I have to support. Now, typically physical core is going to be when I have the scenario of, hey, it is my physical box. So it's a host, and maybe it's running a bunch of virtual machines. So I can buy this in standard and data center, but typically what I'll be doing here is if it's a virtualization host running a lot of Windows 2012 or 2012 R2 VMs, well, on the physical core, if I use data center, then I can run an unlimited number of VMs with 2012, and they would all get these extended security updates. If I use the standard edition, then I get 2 VMs supported on it. And so the typical model will be if I have a lot of 2012 VMs, I'll probably just want to license. Now, I do have to license all of the cores in the box. Now, there's a minimum. It is a 16 core minimum that I have to purchase. So even if this box only had 8 cores, I would still have to do a 16 core minimum license. And again, very commonly, I think with the physical, you're probably going to go data center. Now, one thing I would say is imagine you had a scenario where you had 2012 VMs all over your virtualization estate. Well, I probably don't want to have to license every single virtualization host I have for these ESU cores. Maybe you want to consolidate. Maybe this is the time that you take all those 2012 VMs and consolidate it on a smaller number of hosts. Still make sure you've got resiliency, they're still clustered. But now I'd only have to license the boxes running the 2012 to get those now available for the ESU. And remember, the VMs would still have to be Arc enabled. It's the VM in the guest that has to be Arc enabled to make this work. That really is the core point of all of this. And then my other option is the virtual cores. So here instead it's actually the VMs. And now the virtual core is an 8 core minimum. So for even if this only had, let's say, 2 vCPUs, well, I need 8 cores going to that. This is always going to be standard. Remember, Windows Server Data Center and Standard have exactly the same features. It's only the virtualization rights that are different between them. So if it's a VM, no matter where it is, could be in other clouds, I'll just use the standard because the standard license is cheaper. So I would use the standard virtual core. And there's going to be a balance. If I have maybe just the odd VM on a box, then it probably makes sense to license the virtual cores for that VM. But again, if I have a lot of the VMs on a virtualization host, then it may be cheaper to actually just license the host. And there's some actually nice documentation about this. So documentation talks about the options available to me. And it stresses here, look, the physical core licensing, hey, there's no limit to the number of VMs that can be covered. But if you only had a couple of VMs, maybe it makes sense to just do the VMs. For the virtual core licensing, hey, this could be a third-party host or a hyperscaler. You're going to elect the standard edition for virtual core licenses. There's really no point in having the data center there. But then it walks through a whole bunch of scenarios. So if you're not sure, read through these and it's going to give you an idea of, okay, well, this looks like it's what I'm doing. But it's always going to be that balance of, well, does it make sense to probably do the data center on the physical cores, or does it make more sense to just do the individual virtual machine? So that's the balance you're going to leverage as part of this. And again, don't forget about the option that you can obviously consolidate down to make the most sense. Now, just so you understand what happens here, is when I do this Arc enablement, I don't have to do a special key. There's no MAC key deployment. It's all handled by this Arc agent. So this connected machine agent, once it gets enrolled to an active Azure Arc ESU license, and it then becomes eligible to receive those extended security update patches, under the hood, what actually happens is a certificate gets installed into the guest OS, which is why I have to have the Arc enabled in every single OS so it can go and get the certificate, because then the Windows servicing and delivery is going to check the eligibility of the server to receive the ESU patches by looking for that certificate. It's similar to the check that's used in Azure or Azure Stack HCI to give it the free ESUs on those platforms. So that's why it has to be enrolled. How you deploy the updates is completely up to you. I could still use SCCM, I could use WSAS. Obviously, Azure has Azure Update Manager, which is generally the preferred solution, but I don't have to use that at all. The Arc agent, once it's then linked to that ESU license, will do everything you need. There's nothing else required of you. Now, if we go and look at this again, so this time I'm going to jump over to Azure Arc. And actually notice we have this option of extended security updates. If I go and look at my extended security updates, you will firstly see I'm looking at licenses. And so as I was explaining, I have to go and create a license for each of these instances I want to protect. The one caveat to that is obviously if I'm licensing the physical box, then the license would apply to multiple virtual machines. So here you go and you create the licenses. So if I did create license, the key things here is, now you can select to activate later. Activate later would potentially be maybe I'm not sure and I'd want to delete it, or maybe I need procurement to go and complete some detail about it. But the key details are, what is my edition? Remember, if it's going to be a virtual core, I'm always going to use standard. So it's data center or standard. And then, is it physical or virtual? And then when I pick that, I would then pick the number of core packs required to cover either the minimums, if I have less than the minimum, or the actual number of physical cores in the box, or the virtual cores in the virtual machine. So I would go and add in all those values. And I have to attest, you notice at the bottom, I have software assurance. Now, once I've created those, then we need to go and link it. So then I have this option of eligible resources, and I can see if they're already ESU enabled. So if it was a virtual machine, for example, if it was a VM, I would select the VM. Let's pick this one. And I would say I want to enable the ESU. And I would tell it, well, this is a VM. So for my VM, I know that I'm going to want to use the standard. So the core type is going to be virtual. My ESU license. And then I'm going to see them all. So I would pick the license that I wanted for this particular virtual machine. So it's got the right number of virtual cores. Or I could even go and create one. So I can combine it into one step. You notice I can select multiple machines. So let's say I could pick all of these. So I could pick 4 VMs, but it's still only asking me to link it to one license. Well, the scenario here, and it's important to understand the way the rules work of this. Consider what we said before about how this can work. So if my scenario is those 4 machines were VMs, well, maybe those VMs are all running on the same box. So what I'm telling it is, hey, this license, because it's licensed for this host and these VMs are running on that host, well, then that license can be used by n number of VMs. So it could be a 1 to n, because the single license that's covering all of the cores of the physical box supports many, many virtual machines. So these multiple 2012 instances that happen to be VMs on that box, well, they're being covered by that one license of the physical cores. But if it was a physical host, then it's going to be a 1-to-1. Likewise, if it's a virtual license, then it's always going to be a 1-to-1. I can't say create one license with 16 virtual cores and link it to 2 VMs. It's a 1-to-1 mapping. There are some DR and some dev scenarios that may modify that a little bit, but that's the key point of it. I create a license for the target, but realize if the target was that data center, it could be standard if there's only 2 VMs, but if the target is physical core, then that physical core license, I could then associate to multiple VMs, because those VMs are being covered by the fact that they run on the host that has those physical cores license. So that's why you can see this option of linking one license to multiple instances, because in this case, the assumption is these are all VMs and they're all running on the physical box that I'm about to pick the license that I created for that physical box. So that's the idea behind it. And again, once I do that, that's it. All of that magic now happens. The Azure Arc connected machine agent sees the assignment and installs the cert. Then when there are actual patches delivered for it, hey, great, it's going to be eligible for those extended security updates. There's nothing else I have to do. Now, what is the timing for this? So remember what it showed us. It showed us that the end of support was this October 10th, 2023. So it's at this point those ESUs have to kick in. Now, what if I don't? What if, for example, remember it's a monthly charge against my Azure consumption bill. What if I actually went and enabled it in December 2023 or any time? It could be March 2024. It doesn't matter because I have to be covered from October 10th, 2023. So the point I enable it, there will be a one-time back bill to that date. And then, so obviously I'm paying that money for the elapsed time between whatever it is before December, so my November, and then 20 days, 30 days, 21 days of October, and then the ongoing monthly. So I can't think, oh, everything's fine, I'm not going to bother with this. Oh, wow, in March there's a big security thing. I'll just turn it on for March and pay for the month for March. Nope. When you turn it on, it will back bill you back to this date. So that's the way the payment works for this. So again, this is for the Windows server. And once again, if it gets to February and I upgrade that OS instance to 2016 or 2019, at the end of February, it will just stop the billing. It will kill that license off. So I won't need that anymore. Great. This was focused on, hey, I have Windows Server 2012 still. However, one of the most popular applications we see on Windows Server 2012, so I thought I should cover it as well, is probably SQL Server 2012. And so what can I do? And it's very common here, which is why I thought I'd cover it just super quickly. What do I do if I still have ye old SQL? So here I could think about, okay, I also have SQL 2012. And the story is much the same. This same option of the Arc-enabled ESU is available for SQL Server. Now, one important thing about SQL Server, though, is realize that SQL Server actually went out of support all the way back, I think it was it July 11th, 2022. And so when I think about SQL Server 2012, your year one of the ESU would have to have been that traditional approach. There's no choice for that. So your traditional will have been used for the year one for the 2022. But now you're in year two, and once again, I can think about, well, that July 11th, now I could switch, if I wanted to, I can still do the traditional annual pay upfront CapEx, or now I can do this. So now the same thing would apply. Let's say I decide to switch in September. Well, I will get the one-time back bill. And it is assuming you were licensed using traditional for year one. I don't think it's checking. A lot of things in Azure is a trust-based system. It's trusting you were covered year one with traditional. But now for your year two, I don't want to pay, not paying for this anymore. I want to use the Arc-based. So now I'm going to actually switch. I turn on that Arc license in September. It will do the one-time back bill for the hours That's actually one of the interesting things about SQL. It's hourly based instead of the whole month. The hours to July 11th, and then, sure, it's going to continue billing me monthly. So that's the way that would work. And obviously, all of these, I'm paying for all of that. Now, the technology behind this is really the same idea. I have this SQL box, and obviously that SQL box is running on an operating system. So what I have done on here is I've Arc enabled it, which means it has that connected machine agent. And what actually happens here is when Arc sees that SQL is supported on that, Arc will automatically install the SQL extension. So it does this, and now it's going to add the SQL extension. And again, that's free. And this can actually bring some really interesting functionality. Now, the functionality will vary, but for example, it does a detection on the back end based on MS sales records, on if you have SA purchased or pay as you go, and it can actually light up additional functionalities, auto patching, auto backup. There are license compliance, things to help you check, Azure AD, there's a whole bunch of things I can just get for these instances now, it just lights up. But now when I have this, I can now turn on this SQL ESU. It's always going to be vCore. So it's always vCore for the Arc enabled, and it is a minimum of 4. And all I'm going to do is basically link it to the particular instance. So if we jump over again, let's go and have a look. Okay, so now what I'm going to go and look at is in my data services, I can see my SQL Server instances. So here, if I just select this instance, and it's showing me here, my ESU status is disabled. So all I have to do is go into that ESU status, scroll down, and I can subscribe. And it's telling me all the requirements. So it's saying, hey, look, you did have year 1 extended ESU. You're going to activate this feature. You're okay with the charges, etc., etc. Remember, it does have to be covered by software assurance still. That is still a requirement. But I would just click that button and I'm good to go. And so now we have that same choice for SQL Server. Again, I don't have to. I can carry on with the traditional. Again, it requires the Arc, so it requires the connectivity. If I was air-gapped, I'd have to stay on that traditional approach. But now for your year 2, if you wanted to, I can switch to the more flexible option. And one of the nice things about the SQL that's a little bit different, if I did switch and upgraded it, it's actually hourly based, so I don't even have to continue paying for the complete month. It's the hours where I had that ESU applied to the 2012. And so that was it. I mean, that was my, what do? You do have to be a contributor or owner to apply and ESU to an instance. But this is the story. Ideally, get out of the way, get off of Windows 2012, get off of SQL 2012. I can either, hey, migrate the app or roll to a fresh. I can do an in-place upgrade if it's supported by the application. I can aid myself in doing those upgrades, maybe take this opportunity to, hey, move it to the cloud. Whereas part of Azure Migrate, it can do the in-place upgrade for me. There are things to help me move to maybe app service or a managed PaaS database offering. But if I can't get off of Windows 2012, hey, go and move it to Azure. I get it free those 3 years, or move it to an Azure-based hosting platform. Could be Azure VMware solution, the Nutanix solution, Azure Stack Edge, Hub, Stack. If I can't, then I Arc enable it. When I Arc enable it, now I can use the monthly based ESU. I could still do the non-Arc, I could still do traditional if I wanted. This is just a lot more flexible, and I get a lot of the benefits of Arc. Some of those previously I paid for. When I do the Arc enablement, I get additional nice features. The machine configuration of the guest OS, change tracking inventory, and update management. So I do get additional features there as well. So I can get different options. Again, I might think about consolidating if I want to do the physical host. And then if I have SQL 2012, hey, I have similar options for bringing Arc to that and doing that hourly based billing. So I hope that was useful. As always, till the next video, take care.